There's a moment, and if you've ever lived close enough to wild things, you know the one I mean. When you look into an animal's eyes and stop seeing an animal altogether. You see something else, something that costs you sleep, something that makes you question every story you were handed as a child about what deserves to live and what doesn't. I've been a working man my whole life. Calloused hands, cracked boots, a back that argues with me every morning before the coffee's done. I don't have a poet's tongue. I don't reach for pretty words when plain ones do the job. But I'm going to tell you about a wolf. And about the month I spent watching a town decide whether she deserved to breathe. And about what happened when I stopped letting other people make that choice for me. Because they said she was dangerous. They said she was a killer. They said the only good wolf was a dead wolf, and half the men who said it had never even seen one up close. I had, and I'm telling you, what I saw wasn't a monster. What I saw was something cornered, bleeding, and still refusing to quit. If that makes her dangerous, then I don't know what word we've got left for the rest of us. I found her on a Tuesday, which matters only because Tuesdays in Harlan County were supposed to be boring. I had a routine. Most ranchers do, because routine is the only thing standing between you and the particular chaos that comes with working land that doesn't care whether you live or die. Up before the sun. Coffee so thick it could float a horseshoe. Check the fence line along the northern pasture. Rotate the cattle to the east field if the grass held. Come back in time for noon, eat whatever was left from the night before, and spend the afternoon fixing whatever had broken since morning, which was always something. That Tuesday, the something was a gap in the fence along the ravine's lip. The ravine itself cut through the southeastern corner of my property like God had dragged a thumb through wet clay. It wasn't deep enough to be dramatic, but it was plenty deep enough to break a leg if you weren't paying attention. I'd lost 2 calves to it over the years, not to a fall, but because the brush down there grew thick and a young animal could wander in and just not find its way back. The fence was supposed to prevent that. The fence had opinions about its own obligations. I was down on one knee with a pair of pliers, working a loose post back into alignment when I heard it. Not a sound I'd describe as threatening, more like a breath that had been held too long and finally couldn't hold anymore. A low, dragging exhale that came up from the brush below the lip of the ravine, and my first thought, honestly, was mountain lion. My hand went to the rifle on my back before my brain had finished processing. I stayed still, listened. It came again, the same exhausted sound, and underneath it now, the faintest whimper, not feral, not predatory, something pained. I don't know why I leaned over the edge instead of stepping back. Maybe stubbornness. Maybe the particular brand of stupidity that gets ranchers killed in the back 40 when nobody's around to stop them. But I leaned over, parted the brush with the rifle barrel, and looked down. She was lying on her side in the drainage mud at the bottom of the ravine. Gray, huge, actually, bigger than I'd expected, though I'd only seen wolves twice before in my life and both times from a distance. Her ribcage was visible through her fur in a way that made me feel something uncomfortable in my chest, like watching a person who hadn't eaten in too long trying to pretend they weren't hungry. Her left hind leg was angled wrong. Not broken at the joint, I'd learn later, but badly torn. Something had gotten hold of her, or she'd been caught in something, and she'd pulled free the hard way. There was blood in the mud beneath her, old blood darkened to rust. She'd been down there for at least a day. Her eyes were open. That was the thing. Lying there in the mud, bleeding, starved down to her bones, and her eyes were open and tracking me with an attention that wasn't fear, exactly. It was something more complicated than fear. It was the particular look of a creature that has been afraid for so long that it's moved through fear into something quieter, a kind of bleak assessment, like she was looking at me and calculating odds. I pulled back from the edge, stood up, counted my heartbeats the way my father taught me to when I was young and scared and needed to think straight. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The sensible thing was obvious. She was injured, probably dying. A wolf on the ravine edge of my property was a liability in every direction. Livestock, safety, law. Harlan County had never had much patience for wolves even when they were healthy and minding their own business, which was itself a matter of ongoing disagreement between the ranchers and the conservation people who'd been fighting over reintroduction for the better part of a decade. A wounded wolf was an emergency call to the county wildlife office, maybe a mercy shot if she wasn't going to make it. Sensible, clean, easy. I looked at my hands, the pliers, the loose fence post. I went back to the edge and looked at her again. She hadn't moved, still watching me. That same calculating stillness, that same patient taking of odds, and something in the quality of her attention made me feel like the one being assessed rather than the one doing the assessing. "You're a problem," I said out loud. She blinked, slow, heavy, not a response exactly, but not nothing either. I don't have a good explanation for what I did next. I've turned it over enough times in the weeks since that I've worn the edges off it, and it still doesn't resolve into something I can defend logically. I went back to the barn, got a length of rope and a canvas tarp and a bucket of water, and I climbed down into the ravine. She didn't try to attack me. I want to be clear about that, because when I've told this story since, there's always a point where someone expects that detail, the lunge, the snap, the dramatic near-death moment that proves she was dangerous. It didn't happen. What happened was that she watched me come down the side of the ravine with the same patience she'd been watching me with before. And when I got within arm's reach and set the water bucket down in front of her, she lifted her head about 2 inches off the mud, and then let it fall again, like even that had cost her more than she had. I sat there for a while, not close enough to crowd her, just present. I have a habit, a bad one, according to my ex-wife, though she had a talent for cataloging my failings that I sometimes think deserved its own ledger, of talking to things that can't talk back. Fences, cattle, the tractor when it won't turn over. It's not something I'm proud of exactly, but it's not something I'm ashamed of either. Living alone on 40 acres of rangeland for going on 11 years will do things to a man's sense of appropriate audience. So I talked to her. I told her about the fence post, about the Tuesday routine, about how the east field grass was going thin on the north side and I was going to have to seed it before winter or I'd regret it in February. I told her she was in a bad spot and I wasn't sure what I was going to do about it yet, but that I wasn't going to do anything while she was looking at me like that, because it felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. At some point during all of this, she drank from the bucket. Not eagerly, carefully, like she was making a decision about trust and wasn't fully convinced of it yet, but had concluded the water was worth the risk. I refilled the bucket. I climbed back out of the ravine. I went back to the barn and I stood there for a long time with my hands on the fence rail and had an argument with myself that I knew, even in the middle of it, I'd already lost. I called Roy Tesmer first, because Roy was the closest thing Harlan County had to a wildlife veterinarian, which meant he was actually a large animal vet who'd done some coursework on predators and had a federal permit that covered a gray area wide enough to drive a truck through. Roy was a practical man in the way that people get practical when they've spent 30 years watching animals die, which is to say he had a dry, unsentimental relationship with what was possible and what wasn't. "Injured wolf," I said when he picked up. A pause. "Where?" "My property, ravine by the southeast fence." "How bad?" "Hind leg, she's been down there at least a day, dehydrated." Another pause, longer this time. I could hear Roy thinking, which for Roy sounded like slow, measured breathing with occasional clicks of his tongue. "She's probably done," he said. "Wolves with leg injuries that bad don't generally." She drank from a bucket I put down. Silence. "Roy, I heard you," more slow breathing. "Cal, you know what's going to happen if word gets around that you've got a wolf on your property." "I know. People are already wound up about the reintroduction business. Harkins lost 2 lambs last month. Duchamp's convinced wolves took his." "I know," I said again. "You're going to have county wildlife out there, possibly state. You're going to have Harkins and Duchamp, and probably that man with the loud truck from over on Route 9, who I've never been introduced to, but who seems to have opinions about." "Roy," she drank the water. He was quiet for long enough that I thought the line had dropped. "I'll come out tomorrow morning," he said, "early, before anyone sees my truck." Roy's assessment was grim but not terminal, which is the best combination you can hope for from Roy. The leg had been caught, a snare, he thought, based on the wound pattern, one of the steel-jaw traps that were technically illegal in the county, but that Roy had seen evidence of before. She'd pulled herself free over what must have been hours of effort, which meant she'd done significant secondary damage to the tissue and muscle, but the bone itself was intact. "She shouldn't have survived dragging herself this far," Roy said, which was not quite a compliment but functioned as one. "She's stubborn," I said. Roy looked at me sideways. He has a face that was apparently designed by nature for skepticism. Heavy brows, a long jaw, eyes that sit slightly too deep and see things from the back of a particular kind of exhaustion. "You're going to keep her." It wasn't a question. "I'm going to get her stable," I said. "Then figure out the next part. The next part being that you can't keep a wolf. The next part being that I'm not going to figure it out today." Roy made a sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite a word. He cleaned the wound with the kind of focused economy that comes from long practice. No wasted motion, no sentimentality, just work. She let him do it. That surprised me, and I could see it surprised Roy too, though he didn't say so. She held still through the cleaning and the temporary splinting with a quality of patience that I'd already started thinking of as hers specifically, distinct from anything I'd observed in other animals. Not resignation, not shock, something more deliberate, like she'd made a decision. "She's been around people before," Roy said. "How can you tell?" "The way she's letting me touch her." He smoothed the bandaging, sat back on his heels. "She's afraid, but she's overriding it." He looked at her for a moment, really looked, the way he didn't usually look at animals, like he was trying to work something out. "Where'd she come from?" "Don't know. Wolves have been showing up further east the last couple years. Could be a dispersal from the reintroduction population." He stood, stripped off his gloves. "Or she was someone's." The last possibility sat in the air between us with a particular weight. "I'll need to run a check on reported surrenders," Roy said. "It'll take a few days, discreetly." "I appreciate that." He gathered his kit. Paused at the mouth of the ravine. We'd rigged a tarp down there, more shelter than I could realistically build overnight, but enough to keep the rain off her. "Cal." "Yeah. People around here are not going to see this the way you do." I didn't say anything because it wasn't news. "I mean people specifically," Roy said. "Not wildlife officers, not the reintroduction people. I mean the men you know, the ones you share fence line with." "I know." He nodded once, the way you nod when you're satisfied that someone understands the nature of the problem they've chosen. "I'll call you about the check," he said, and then he left. I climbed back down into the ravine and sat with her while the afternoon light shifted, and the shadows lengthened, and the creek further down the ravine made its particular sound over the limestone bed, and I thought about what Roy had said. She was watching me again, that calculating attention, odds being run. "I don't know what you've been through," I said. She blinked. "But I'm going to need you to hold on." She put her head down on her forepaws. I took that as agreement. The problem started on Thursday. I'd known it was coming. Harlan County was not a large community, and large communities at least have the mercy of anonymity. In Harlan County, there was no such thing. Roy's truck had been seen on my road by someone who told Bert Harkins, and Bert Harkins had a mouth approximately the size and carrying capacity of the county itself. He called me Thursday noon, just as I was coming in from the east field. "Heard you've got a wolf." I thought about denying it. "I've got an injured animal on my property." "Cal, don't." Roy came out to look at her. "Roy Tesmer doesn't make house calls for injured coyotes, which is what you'd have said if that's what it was." Bert's voice had the particular quality of a man who'd been nursing an opinion for a long time and was pleased to finally have reason to deliver it. "Listen, I understand you've got some kind of softness about this, always have. But you know what those things cost me last." "You don't know it was wolves," I said, which was a conversation we'd had before and would apparently have again. "I know what dragged my lambs. You know what your land looks like in the morning. That's not the same thing." A pause that carried several different kinds of anger in it. "She's going to bring more. You know how they work," she goes back, she tells the pack, "and come spring you've got." "She's not going back anywhere for a while," I said. "She's barely mobile." "Then that's the mercy of it," Bert said. "Cal, don't make this harder than it is. Put her down or call wildlife services and let them do it. Either way, you're not going to come out of this with what you're hoping for." "What am I hoping for?" He sighed. "Heavy, tired. I don't know, that's the part that worries me." He hung up. I stood in my kitchen with the phone in my hand and the coffee going cold on the counter and thought about what he'd said. Not the surface of it, the underneath. Because Bert Harkins was not an evil man. He was a frightened man, which is different, and a tired man, which is different still, and the combination of frightened and tired in a county where everyone knew your business was the kind of pressure that could turn reasonable people into something harder than they'd meant to be. I went out and fed the cattle. I checked the water troughs. I spent an hour fixing the tractor belt that had been threatening to go for 2 weeks. And then I went down into the ravine and sat with a wolf while the sun set and the air cooled and the first stars came on, and I thought about what I believed, not what I'd been told. What I, Calvin James Rourke, who had worked this land for 11 years and buried a father on it, and ended a marriage on it and built something on it that was entirely and only mine, what I believed. She was breathing steadily. Eating now, Roy had left supplies, and she'd accepted them without drama. The leg was bad, but she was managing. Her eyes were open, and her ears tracked every sound in the ravine with a precision that reminded me that whatever else she was built for this land as much as I was. Built for exactly this kind of darkness, this kind of patience, this kind of waiting for the odds to shift. I had a decision to make. It wouldn't wait much longer. The meeting at the Harlan County Feed and Grain wasn't announced formally, because formal announcements imply organization, and what gathered in that building on Friday evening was less an organization than a collective mood. The kind that builds in small towns the way weather builds, without a clear origin point, just a gradual darkening and thickening, until you realize a storm has been coming for days, and you're the last one who didn't notice. I got there late, which was not strategic. I'd spent longer than I planned checking on her. She'd managed to shift herself into a slightly better position, which Roy had said would be a good sign if it happened, evidence of healing motivation, he called it, which was the clinical term for something I'd described to myself differently. And by the time I got to the Feed and Grain, there were already 15 men inside, and the temperature of the conversation had been climbing for a while. Bert was there, which I'd expected. Dale Whitmore, who ran sheep on the county's west side, 2 of the Dutchamp brothers. Pete Vargas, who was newer to the county, having bought out the old Brennan place 3 years back, and who was the kind of convert that made me reflect on how long it takes a person to start loving a thing versus how long it takes them to start protecting it like they'd built it themselves. And Tom Grady, which I hadn't expected. Tom ran the hardware store on Main. He wasn't a rancher. He had no livestock to lose. But Tom Grady was the man in Harlan County who had the ear of the county commissioner, and the county commissioner had the authority to contact state wildlife services, and state wildlife services had the authority to designate an animal a threat to public safety, and that designation had its own particular ending. I stood in the door for a moment and surveyed the room before anyone noticed me, which is a habit I developed living alone. You stop announcing yourself because there's no one to announce to, and you start reading spaces before you enter them. What I read was, this was already decided. The argument was about how, not whether. Bert saw me. The room followed his attention. "Cal," he said, not unfriendly, not quite. "Bert," I pulled a chair from near the wall, turned it around, sat on it backwards with my arms across the top rail. "I'd have appreciated a call." "We called the relevant parties," Dale Whitmore said, and the edge in it was professional. Dale had the kind of precise social meanness that comes from intelligence applied to grievance over many years. "I have an injured animal on my property." "You have a wolf on your property," said Pete Vargas, with the emphasis of a man proving a point he'd been winning in his head for a while. I looked at him for a moment. "You ever seen one up close?" "I've seen what they leave behind." "That's not what I asked." Tom Grady cleared his throat, which was the sound of a man who needed things to stay efficient. "Cal, nobody here is unsympathetic to where you're coming from. You found an animal in need. That's a decent impulse. But the question of what this means for the county, for livestock, for the situation with the reintroduction program." "The reintroduction program," I said, "is 100 miles west of here." "And animals travel," Bert said quietly, "no heat in it." Just the flatness of a fact he'd been living with. He wasn't wrong. I knew he wasn't wrong. I'd been turning that same fact over for 2 days. "She's not mobile," I said. "For now. Roy says 6 weeks minimum before the leg is weight-bearing." "And after 6 weeks?" I didn't have an answer for that yet, which was probably obvious, and which didn't help my position. "Here's what I'd like to avoid," Tom Grady said, settling his hands flat on the table in the way of a man who decided to be the voice of reason whether everyone wanted it or not. I'd like to avoid something being done informally that puts anyone here in legal jeopardy. The county has a process for. The county process ends the same place, I said. Cal, you all know it does. I looked around the room. 15 men, some of them I'd known for a decade. Some of them I'd worked fence with, helped through bad seasons, sat with after losses. And not one of them looking at me right now had the particular expression of someone who thought I was going to win this. State wildlife designates her a threat, they come out, and that's the end of it. That might be the appropriate outcome, Tom Grady said. She hasn't touched a single head of my livestock, I said. She hasn't touched anyone's livestock. You've got no confirmed evidence she's been on this range more than 3 days, and 2 of those she spent bleeding in a ravine. The snare, Dale Whitmore said, surprising me. His voice had changed slightly, some of the precision gone, something underneath it. You said Roy thought it was a snare. He did. Snares are illegal. Yes. So someone, Dale stopped. I watched him work through something. He looked down at his hands for a moment, which was not a thing I'd seen Dale Whitmore do before. Someone was trapping illegally, I said carefully. And she pulled herself free. That's the whole story of how she ended up in that ravine. The room was quieter than it had been. That doesn't change what she is, Pete Vargas said, but with less certainty than before. No, I agreed. It doesn't. I stood up, the chair scraped. But it changes what we are depending on what we do next. I left before Tom Grady could organize the conversation back into something productive. Roy called me Saturday morning, while I was down in the ravine with her. I'd gotten into the habit of spending an hour down there in the mornings. There's no sophisticated explanation for it. Part of it was monitoring, watching how she moved, how much she was eating, whether the wound showed signs of infection. But part of it, the part I'm less comfortable cataloging, was simpler than that. She was good company. She was quiet and present, and she paid attention the way almost no one I knew paid attention anymore. And sitting in that ravine with the morning light coming down through the cottonwood leaves, and the creek making its particular sound, felt like the most honest hour of my day. Found something, Roy said when I answered. Tell me. She's chipped, a pause. I ran the chip against the reintroduction program registry, which took some doing because they're not exactly forthcoming with that information, but I've got a contact. Another pause, and Roy's pauses had texture. This one was the texture of a man deciding how to say something. She was released 2 years ago as part of the Western reintroduction, part of a bonded pair. Her mate was confirmed dead 11 months ago. Rancher in the next county west shot him, claimed livestock protection. Legal review was inconclusive. I watched her. She was lying in the morning light, her head up, ears tracking a bird somewhere in the brush above us. She's been alone for almost a year, I said. Moving east the whole time, based on the sighting reports I was able to piece together. She stayed out of people's way, no confirmed livestock incidents. Roy's voice had acquired something new in it, something I hadn't heard from Roy before. Not quite emotion, Roy's relationship with emotion was managed, careful, but proximity to it. Cal, she's been running for almost a year. I thought about what that meant. The distance, the terrain, the winter. A wolf bred for partnership, for a pack structure that she'd lost, moving east on some internal compass that maybe she didn't fully understand, staying out of sight, pulling herself out of a steel-jaw trap and dragging herself into a ravine and lying in the mud and still watching the odds with those steady, calculating eyes. I thought about all of that. Roy, I said, what do I do? He was quiet for a long moment. Legally. You've got gray area. She's a documented reintroduction animal, which gives her some federal coverage. Enough to complicate a county wildlife order, maybe. Not enough to guarantee anything. He exhaled slowly. But Cal, there's another layer to this. The people, he confirmed. Tom Grady's been on the phone with the commissioner, and Harkins, Roy stopped. What? Harkins was seen out near your southeast fence line yesterday afternoon. I stood up from where I'd been crouching. She turned her head and looked at me. Read my body, probably, the sudden tension in it, the shift of weight. I made myself breathe. 4 counts, 5. Thank you, Roy, I said. Cal, I'll call you later. I hung up and sat back down in the mud, which was not the composed exit I'd been planning. But she looked at me with that particular quality of attention, that patient, odds-running attention, and something in it made me realize that standing up and going somewhere with a lot of anger was not going to help anything. I've got a temper. I want to be honest about that, because this story is going to look a certain way from the outside if I'm not careful about it. Like I was a cool, principled man who made reasonable decisions under pressure, and that's not quite right. What I am is a stubborn man with a temper that I've gotten better at managing over the years, mostly because I live alone and the cattle aren't impressed by it. What I felt sitting in that ravine, knowing Bert Harkins had been near my fence line, was furious. Not just at the potential threat, at the shape of it, at the way a creature who had survived more than most humans survive, a steel trap, 11 months of solitary running, starvation, isolation, was being decided upon by people who had never been in a ravine with her, who had never seen her drink from a water bucket like it was a choice, who had never watched her hold still through a vet's hands with an act of will that I still found remarkable, who were making a decision about whether she deserved to live based entirely on what they'd decided she was before they'd ever looked at her. I sat with that feeling for a while, let it settle, and then I did something I almost never did. I called in a favor. Elena Vasquez had been working with the Western Range Wildlife Conservation Project for 6 years and had a voice that sounded like she'd had the same argument so many times it had been worn smooth. I'd met her once at a county town hall about the reintroduction program 3 years back, and I'd signed a petition she'd been circulating, which was the closest I'd come to activism in about 40 years of living. She answered on the second ring. When I'd finished explaining, she was quiet for a moment. "You said she's chipped." Roy confirmed it. Designation number. I read it from the text Roy had sent me. Another silence longer. I heard the sound of a keyboard. "Oh," she said quietly. "You know her." She was yes. She was part of the founding release. One of the pairs we had high hopes for. Her voice had changed, acquired the same thing Roy's had acquired, that proximity to emotion. Her mate was a male we called Navarro. He was, she stopped. The rancher who shot him, it was a legal gray area that shouldn't have been. We tried to push back, but the county review, she stopped again. How bad is the leg? Roy thinks she'll be weight-bearing in 6 weeks with proper care. And the local feeling? Not good. No, she didn't sound surprised. Okay, here's what I can do. She has federal documentation as a reintroduction animal, which means any action against her requires coordination with the federal wildlife program. It doesn't prevent a county wildlife order, but it complicates it. Any error in that process creates significant legal exposure for the county. I can make sure Tom Grady's office knows that. A pause. It buys time. I won't promise more than that. Time is what I need. What are you going to do with the time? I thought about Bert Harkins at my fence line, about Dale Whitmore's face when I'd mentioned the snare, about Tom Grady's hands flat on the table, trying to be the reasonable man in the room. I'm going to try to show people something, I said. Elena Vasquez was quiet long enough that I wasn't sure the call had held. Then, okay, she said, I'll make the calls. Sunday was the day I came closest to losing. I went down to check on her in the morning and found the tarp pulled from its rigging on one side and a note tucked under the water bucket, not a threatening note, which somehow made it worse. Just 2 words in Bert Harkins' handwriting, which I recognized from a decade of shared correspondence about shared fence line. Come on. That was it, come on, which was the most Bert Harkins thing I'd ever read. Not anger, not menace, disappointment. The shorthand of a man who'd thought better of me and was finding out he'd been wrong. She was fine, unbothered. She'd managed to shift herself in the night, and the new position looked more comfortable. And she looked at me when I came down the bank with the morning routine that I was starting to think of as routine. The food, the water check, the wound check, the sitting. Bert was here, I told her. She turned one ear toward me. The other stayed on something in the brush. He's not a bad man, I said. I want to be clear about that. I set the water down, watched her drink, still that same careful consideration before she committed to it, even now, even after days of this. He lost things he worked for, and he decided you were responsible even if he can't prove it because it's easier than deciding the world is just random. That loss is just what happens to people who work hard. I paused. I understand that. I'm not going to pretend I don't. She finished drinking, lifted her head, looked at me. "But you've lost things too," I said, "haven't you?" It was not a question. I picked up the note, read it again, felt the full weight of what Bert Harkins had meant by it, the appeal to a shared language, a shared understanding of what this land was and how it worked and who belonged to it. I folded it carefully and put it in my shirt pocket. And I made a decision. I called Bert Harkins on Sunday afternoon. Not to argue. I want to be clear about that because my impulses weren't entirely noble. I'd spent part of that morning rehearsing arguments in my head. The snare, the federal documentation, the legal exposure for the county, the 11 months of confirmed non-incident movement east. I had a case. I could make it. But when I dialed his number and listened to it ring, I thought about what Roy had said. People around here are not going to see this the way you do. And I thought about what Alina had said about buying time, and I thought about Bert's note, which was still in my shirt pocket, and I understood something. Arguments weren't the problem. Bert Harkins had heard every argument. The people in that feed and grain had heard every argument. Arguments existed in a space where the outcome was in question, and for most of them, the outcome was not in question. What I needed was not to win an argument. What I needed was to change what they saw. "Cal," he said, picking up on the third ring. "Bert, I want to ask you something." A cautious pause. "All right. Will you come out to my property?" A longer pause. The quality of his silence shifted, less guarded, more confused. "What for?" "I want to show you something." "Cal, not to convince you of anything." And I meant it, or I was trying to mean it. "I just want you to see what I'm seeing, and then you can do whatever you think is right." I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. I could hear, underneath that, the sound of his kitchen. He'd always kept a radio on while he cooked, and I'd eaten enough Sunday meals at his table over the years to recognize the particular station. It was still on. "What time?" he said finally. "Morning, before it gets hot." Another pause. "I'll come alone," he said. "I'm not bringing the others." "That's fine." He hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long moment, feeling the particular kind of anxiety that comes before something you can't take back. Because the thing I'd told Bert, "I just want you to see what I'm seeing," was true, but it was also incomplete. What I wanted was larger than that, and I knew it. I wanted something to shift that I didn't know how to shift. I wanted the 15 men in that feed and grain to look at a wolf the way I'd looked at a wolf and come out of it with something different. And that was asking for a lot. That was, maybe, asking for too much. But I didn't have a better move. He came at 7. I met him at the gate and walked him to the ravine without a lot of talk. Bert's not a talker by nature, and I wasn't either, and the morning was cool enough that walking in silence felt right rather than strained. The pasture grass was still heavy with dew, and there were meadowlarks going in the east field, and it was the kind of morning that made you remember why you chose this land in the first place, or why it chose you, because sometimes that's what it feels like. At the edge of the ravine, I stopped. "She's going to be aware of you before you can see her," I said. "Don't make any fast moves, don't crouch down too suddenly." Bert looked at me sideways. "I know how to be around animals, Cal." "I know, I stopped. I just wanted to say it." I went down the bank first, and he followed. She heard us coming, of course. By the time we reached the bottom, her head was up and both ears were forward, tracking Bert with an alertness that was different from how she tracked me. Not aggressive, but fully engaged, a recognition of a variable she hadn't seen before. Bert stopped about 10 feet back. I watched his face. He was a man who had ranched since he was a teenager, who had worked with animals every day of his adult life, and whatever he'd been expecting from the abstract category of wolf on Calvin Rourke's property, I don't think it was this. A creature this large and this gaunt, lying in the mud with a bandaged leg, watching him with the same patient, calculating attention she brought to everything. Not baring her teeth, not posturing, just present, assessing. "She's huge," he said quietly. "Yeah." "Roy's handiwork?" He nodded at the bandaging. 2 days ago, she let him work on her without being restrained. He was quiet for a moment. She lowered her head slightly, not all the way to her forepaws, just an inch or two, which I'd started to recognize as a particular mode of watchful ease. She was still paying attention, but she'd downgraded the assessment. "That's remarkable," Bert said, and his voice had something new in it. Not softened exactly, just interrupted, like a current that had been running in one direction had hit something it hadn't accounted for. We stood there for a while. She tracked us both, drank when I set the bucket down, accepted the food I'd brought with the same unhurried deliberation she always brought to it. At some point, Bert sat down on a flat rock near the bank, which surprised me, because Bert Harkins sitting down in a drainage ravine to watch a wolf eat was not a thing I would have predicted. He didn't say anything. He just watched. "Roy found out she's been moving east for almost a year," I said eventually, keeping my voice low and easy. "Her mate was shot in the county west of here, 11 months ago." Bert was very still. "She's been alone that whole time, moving east, staying clear of ranches for the most part. No confirmed incidents." I paused. "Someone put a snare out in the grazing land west of here. She hit it, pulled herself out over what Roy thinks was several hours." I looked at the leg. "Then got herself here. Through the fencing. There's a gap on the western perimeter I hadn't found yet. She must have come through it." Bert nodded slowly. He was still watching her. She had settled again, her head on her forepaws now, though her eyes were still on us. "You said someone put a snare out." "Roy's assessment." "Illegally." "Yes." He rubbed his jaw with the back of his hand, which was a gesture I recognized as Bert processing something he didn't like. He did it when a calf was born wrong. He did it when a piece of equipment failed at the worst possible moment. The gesture of a man absorbing a fact that required adjustment. "I want to be honest with you," I said. He looked at me. "I don't know what happens in 6 weeks when the leg heals. I don't know where she goes or if she comes back or what that means for the county. Elena Vasquez is involved now, and there's federal coverage complicating any county action. But none of that is what I actually care about right now." I looked at her. "I care about whether we do something I can live with, and I can't live with." I gestured at her. This animal who pulled herself out of a steel trap and made it across 20 miles of rangeland and drank water out of a bucket I brought her and let a vet bandage her leg, I can't be part of deciding she doesn't deserve the chance to heal." Bert was quiet for a long time. "My lambs," he said finally, "I still don't know who took them." "I know, and I'm not going to pretend that doesn't matter. I'm not asking you to." He looked at her again. She had closed her eyes, not asleep. Her ears were still moving, but resting. The morning light was coming down through the cottonwoods in long strips, and she lay in one of them, her gray fur catching the gold of it. And she looked, in that light, less like a problem and more like a fact of the landscape. A thing that had always been here and that the rest of us were working around. "I'm not going to tell Tom Grady to stand down," Bert said. "That's not mine to do." "I know, but I won't push it further." He stood, dusted his jeans, looked at her one more time. "Cal, this doesn't end clean." "No," I agreed. "Whatever she is, whatever you decide to do with these 6 weeks, the county's going to have opinions on the other side of it." "I know that too." He nodded. "All right," and then, before he climbed back up the bank, he said something I hadn't expected. "She's magnificent, isn't she?" It wasn't really a question. "Yeah," I said, "she really is." The 6 weeks that followed were the hardest and strangest of my life on this property, and I have a long list of competitors for that distinction. Elena's legal complications slowed the county process to something navigable. It didn't stop it. There were 2 visits from state wildlife, both professional, both complicated by the federal documentation, both ending without resolution. Pete Vargas organized a letter-writing campaign that I heard about from Roy, who'd heard about it from his sister, who volunteered at the library where they'd printed copies. Dale Whitmore, to my permanent surprise, did not sign it. He told me so himself, stopping his truck at my gate one afternoon, saying nothing more than I heard about the snare, and then driving away, which was, from Dale Whitmore, the equivalent of an extended declaration of solidarity. And she healed. Slowly, imperfectly. She was going to have a limp for the rest of her life, Roy told me. The muscle damage was too significant for a complete recovery. But the wound closed clean. The leg bore weight at 5 weeks. At 6 weeks, she could move the length of the tarp shelter without favoring it more than slightly. I started leaving the gate in the ravine fence open at night. She didn't leave immediately. That surprised me, though maybe it shouldn't have. She stayed for 3 more days, sleeping in the shelter, eating the food I brought, watching me with those particular eyes. And then one morning I came down and she was gone. Just gone, no drama. No goodbye, which would have been absurd to expect, and yet I'm going to admit I'd half been dreading the lack of one. The shelter was empty, and the food I'd left the night before was eaten, and the only sign that she'd been there was the compressed grass where she'd been sleeping, and the particular tracks in the mud near the bank that led toward the open gate. I stood there for a long time. I had a habit, which I've mentioned, of talking to things that can't talk back. I talked to the empty shelter for a while. I told it things that I hadn't found a way to say while she was in it. That I hoped the limp wasn't as bad as it looked in the hard terrain further east. That I hoped she found whatever she was looking for. That I didn't know exactly what I was looking for when I climbed down here with a bucket of water 2 months ago, but that I thought I'd found something adjacent to it. I told it that I didn't regret a single day of the last 6 weeks, which was true even accounting for the county process and Pete Vargas's letter campaign, and the conversation I'd had to have with Tom Grady that had cost me a piece of goodwill I'd been building for years. Then I climbed back up the bank and went to fix the east field fence and make coffee and get on with the Tuesday routine, because routine was the only thing standing between me and the particular chaos that comes with living on land that doesn't care whether you live or die. 3 weeks after she left, Roy called. "There's a sighting report," he said, "from a rancher east of the county line. Confirmed gray wolf female, slight rear leg limp traveling northeast. No incidents reported." A pause. He called it in to Wildlife Services, not to request action, just to log the sighting. I thought about that, a rancher east of the county line who'd seen a wolf and called it in not to remove her but to acknowledge her. To say, "I saw this. It happened. It was real." "Was there anything else in the report?" I asked. "One more thing," Roy said, and his voice had that quality again, that proximity to something he didn't usually let himself near. "The rancher said, and I'm reading directly here, animal appeared in reasonable health and was moving with purpose." Moving with purpose. I held that. I thought about Bert Harkins in the ravine, saying she's magnificent, isn't she, in the voice of a man who hadn't meant to say it. I thought about Dale Whitmore stopping his truck at my gate to say he'd heard about the snare, and then driving away. I thought about her drinking from the water bucket like it was a decision. Like trust was something you weighed against the alternatives every time, and then made a choice, and then made again tomorrow. I didn't say anything for a moment. "Roy," I said finally. "Yeah. I think she was always moving with purpose. We just weren't looking." Roy was quiet. Then, "No," he said, "I don't think we were." The county process concluded 3 months later with a designation that was, as Alina had predicted, complicated by the federal documentation to the point of being unenforceable. Tom Grady accepted this with the grace of a man who'd seen which way things were moving and decided ahead of time not to be on the wrong side of the record. Pete Vargas remained annoyed about it in ways that occasionally surfaced at community meetings and then subsided. Bert Harkins and I still share a fence line. We still talk. Last October he lost a ewe to something, not wolves, Roy confirmed, coyote probably, and I spent an afternoon helping him check his outer fence for gaps. We didn't talk about her. We didn't need to, but there was something in that afternoon that hadn't been there before. Some small, amended thing. Not resolution, land and livestock and loss don't resolve, but something. I don't know where she is now. The last confirmed sighting was 4 months ago, 2 counties east, moving through terrain that Roy says is good wolf country, ridge forest, elk population, adequate water. Whether she found a pack, whether the limp held her back, whether the winter was what it was going to be, I don't know. But I think about the morning she left. The compressed grass where she'd been sleeping. The tracks in the mud leading to the open gate. And I think about the fact that she left through the gate I'd opened, which was not the only gap in my fence line, and which required her to move through the shelter area and past where I'd left the water bucket, past the whole infrastructure of those 6 weeks. She could have gone a different way. She went through the gate I opened. I don't know what to make of that. I've never been a man who reaches for meaning where there might not be any. But I keep the gate open. I don't have a clear reason for it. Maybe something will come through, maybe nothing will. The east field grass is coming in strong this year, for what it's worth. I seeded the north side like I'd planned.